Charlotte Charlie Hayes had spent years perfecting her reputation as the most sought-after wedding planner in the city. Every detail mattered. Every moment had to be flawlessly executed. Her clients trusted her to turn their dreams into reality, and she took that responsibility seriously. So when she walked into the luxurious boutique of Sienna Monroe, she was already bracing herself for a headache. Sienna, with her wild curls, infectious smile, and tendency to ignore deadlines, was Charlie's worst nightmare in a designer dress. And yet, there was something about her, something magnetic, that Charlie couldn't quite ignore. The boutique was a world unto itself, a haven of silk and lace that seemed to hum with creativity. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine candles, and the soft strains of jazz music played in the background, creating an atmosphere that felt both intimate and indulgent. Rows of gowns lined the walls, their fabrics catching the light in a way that made them seem almost alive. Charlie couldn't help but admire the artistry, even as she steeled herself for the inevitable clash of wills. Sienna was behind the counter, her head bent over a sketch pad as she scribbled something with quick, confident strokes. She looked up as the door chimed, her face lighting up with a smile that was equal parts warm and mischievous. "Charlie, darling," she said, her voice smooth and teasing, "you look so tense. You should try breathing exercises, or wine, lots of wine." Charlie exhaled sharply, her clipboard clutched tightly against her chest. She wasn't here for small talk. "We need to talk about the Delacroix wedding. Your team still hasn't provided the final dress alteration schedule. The wedding is in 3 weeks, Sienna. 3. Sienna waved a hand dismissively, her gold bangles clinking softly. "Details, details. The dresses will be perfect. My brides are always stunning." Charlie crossed her arms, her sharp gaze narrowing. "I don't do last-minute surprises. Unlike you, I believe in structure." Sienna stepped out from behind the counter, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She moved with a fluid grace that made Charlie's pulse quicken, though she'd never admit it. Today, Sienna was wearing a fitted emerald green dress that hugged her curves in a way that was both elegant and daring. Charlie forced herself to focus on the conversation, not the way the fabric shimmered as Sienna walked. "Structure is great," Sienna said, her voice low and teasing. "So is passion. And you, Charlie Hayes, could use a little of both." The tension between them was always thick, but something about this time felt different. Electrified, Charlie could feel the heat of Sienna's gaze as it lingered on her, and for a moment, she forgot to breathe. She quickly looked away, focusing on the rows of gowns lining the walls. "Just get me the schedule," she said, her voice clipped. Sienna tilted her head, her curls catching the light. "You know, for someone who plans the most romantic days of people's lives, you're awfully resistant to a little spontaneity." Charlie's jaw tightened. "Spontaneity is overrated." "Is it?" Sienna took a step closer, her perfume, something warm and floral, washing over Charlie. "Or are you just afraid to let go?" Charlie's heart skipped a beat, but she refused to back down. "I'm not afraid of anything." Sienna's smile widened, and for a moment, Charlie thought she might say something else. Something that would unravel the carefully constructed walls she'd built around herself. But instead, Sienna simply stepped back, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "We'll see about that." As Charlie turned to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that Sienna was watching her. She glanced over her shoulder and caught Sienna's gaze, those dark eyes filled with a challenge. Or maybe a promise. Charlie quickly looked away, her cheeks burning. She told herself it was frustration, not attraction, that made her heart race. But deep down, she knew better. Outside, the city buzzed with its usual energy, but Charlie felt oddly off balance. She climbed into her car and sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Sienna Monroe was chaos incarnate, and Charlie had no room for chaos in her life. So why did the thought of seeing her again send a thrill through her veins? When the mother of the bride, an elite socialite with a penchant for perfection, insisted that Charlie and Sienna personally oversee the entire wedding aesthetic together, Neither had a choice but to comply. A week of close collaboration? It was a disaster waiting to happen. Charlie could already feel the headache forming behind her temples. Their first site visit was a battlefield of opinions. The venue, a sprawling estate with manicured gardens and a grand ballroom, was stunning. But as Charlie and Sienna stood in the middle of the empty space, their visions for the wedding couldn't have been more different. Soft pastels for the ceremony, Charlie said firmly, tapping her clipboard. Elegant, timeless, and understated. The bride wants classic sophistication. Sienna tilted her head, her curls bouncing as she considered the space. Bold jewel tones, she countered. This is love, not a hospital waiting room. We need something vibrant, something that feels. Charlie's jaw tightened. The bride specifically requested a soft, romantic palette. We're not here to reinvent the wheel, Sienna. Sienna stepped closer, her heels clicking against the marble floor. And we're not here to put everyone to sleep either. Love isn't soft and pastel, Charlie. It's bold, it's messy, it's alive. Charlie crossed her arms, her gaze narrowing. Why do you always have to push back? Sienna's lips curved into a smirk as she closed the distance between them. Because watching you get all worked up is fun. Charlie's breath hitched as Sienna stepped into her personal space. Her perfume, something warm and intoxicating, filling the air. She could see the flecks of gold in Sienna's dark eyes, the way her lips parted slightly as she spoke. Charlie's heart raced, but she refused to back down. You're impossible, Charlie muttered, her voice softer than she intended. Sienna's smile widened. And you're predictable, but I think that's why we balance each other so well. Charlie opened her mouth to retort, but the words caught in her throat as Sienna reached out and adjusted the collar of her blazer. Her fingers brushed against Charlie's neck, sending a shiver down her spine. Sienna's touch lingered for a moment too long, her gaze locking with Charlie's. Relax, Charlie, Sienna murmured. This doesn't have to be a war. Charlie swallowed hard, her mind racing. She wanted to argue, to remind Sienna that this was a professional collaboration, not a whatever this was. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she took a step back, putting distance between them. Let's just focus on the task at hand, Charlie said, her voice clipped. She turned her attention back to her clipboard, but her hands were trembling slightly. She could still feel the ghost of Sienna's touch on her skin. The rest of the visit was a blur of measurements, sketches, and more bickering. But every time Sienna laughed or brushed past her, Charlie felt that same electric charge, that same pull she couldn't quite explain. By the time they wrapped up, she was exhausted, and not just from the work. As they stood outside the venue, the sun setting behind them, Sienna turned to Charlie with a grin. See? That wasn't so bad, was it? Charlie raised an eyebrow. Define not so bad. Sienna laughed, the sound warm and melodic. We didn't kill each other. I'd call that a win. Charlie couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips. Barely. Sienna's gaze softened, and for a moment, the teasing glint in her eyes faded. You know, Charlie, you don't always have to be so controlled. Sometimes it's okay to let go. Charlie's chest tightened at the words. Letting go wasn't something she did easily, or ever, really. But the way Sienna was looking at her made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, she could try. I'll keep that in mind, Charlie said, her voice quieter than she intended. Sienna's smile returned, brighter than before. Good, because I have a feeling this is going to be one hell of a week. As Sienna walked away, Charlie couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. This collaboration was going to test her in ways she hadn't expected, and not just professionally. Late nights had become the norm for Charlie and Sienna as they worked tirelessly to bring the Delacroix wedding to life. The estate was quiet now, the only sounds the soft rustle of fabric and the occasional hum of Sienna's voice as she sketched ideas. Charlie sat at a table, her laptop open and her glasses perched on her nose, surrounded by spreadsheets and timelines. She was in her element, but the weight of Sienna's presence, just a few feet away, was impossible to ignore. Sienna was sprawled on a chaise lounge, her sketchpad balanced on her knees. She had kicked off her heels hours ago, and her curls were piled into a messy bun that somehow still looked effortlessly chic. Charlie glanced up from her screen and caught Sienna watching her, a small smile playing on her lips. "What?" Charlie asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "Nothing," Sienna said, her tone light. "You just look intense. It's kind of adorable." Charlie rolled her eyes, but she could feel the heat creeping up her neck. "I'm working. Unlike some people, I don't have the luxury of lounging around." Sienna sat up, her sketchpad falling to the floor as she stretched. "Relax, Charlie. The world won't end if you take a break." Charlie opened her mouth to argue, but the words died on her lips as Sienna stood and walked over to her. She moved with a confidence that was both infuriating and mesmerizing, her bare feet silent on the polished floor. Charlie's breath hitched as Sienna leaned over her shoulder, her warmth seeping through the thin fabric of Charlie's blouse. "You've been staring at that screen for hours," Sienna murmured, her voice low and close. "What are you working on that's so important?" Charlie swallowed hard, her fingers freezing on the keyboard. "The seating chart, it's complicated." Sienna chuckled, the sound sending a shiver down Charlie's spine. "Of course it is. You're the only person I know who could make a seating chart look like a military operation." Charlie turned her head slightly, her gaze meeting Sienna's. They were so close now that she could see the faint freckles dusting Sienna's nose, the way her dark lashes framed her eyes. "Someone has to keep things organized," Charlie said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sienna's smile softened, and for a moment, the teasing glint in her eyes faded. "You really love this, don't you?" she asked, her tone unexpectedly sincere. Charlie hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "Love what?" "All of it," Sienna said, gesturing to the room. "The planning, the details, the way you make everything perfect. You love it." Charlie looked away, her chest tightening. "It's my job." "It's more than that," Sienna said, her voice gentle. "You care. You want people to have the perfect day because you believe in love. I can see it in the way you work." Charlie's throat felt dry, her usual defenses crumbling under Sienna's gaze. "Love should be celebrated, right?" she admitted quietly. Sienna's hand brushed against Charlie's shoulder, her touch light but electric. "You ever been in love, Charlie?" The question caught her off guard, and for a moment she couldn't speak. "Too busy," she said finally, but her voice wavered. Sienna's fingers trailed up to tuck a strand of hair behind Charlie's ear, her touch lingering. "That's a shame," she murmured. "Someone like you deserves to be swept off their feet." Charlie's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing. She should pull away, should remind Sienna, and herself, that this was strictly professional. But she couldn't move. She was frozen, caught in the gravity of Sienna's presence. "Sienna?" Charlie started, but the words caught in her throat. Sienna's gaze dropped to Charlie's lips, and for a moment, the air between them was charged with something unspoken. Then, slowly, Sienna straightened, her hand falling away. "We should call it a night," she said, her voice soft. "You look exhausted." Charlie blinked, the spell broken. She nodded, her mind still reeling. "Yeah, you're probably right." As Sienna gathered her things, Charlie couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. The tension that had always been there felt sharper now, more urgent. And as she watched Sienna walk away, her heart still racing, Charlie realized that she was in trouble. The argument started over something trivial, a disagreement about the floral arrangements for the reception. Charlie wanted classic white roses. Sienna insisted on something bolder, more unconventional. But what began as a professional debate quickly escalated into something personal. "You're impossible!" Charlie snapped, her voice sharp with frustration. She gestured to the mood board on the table, her finger tapping against the image of the roses. "This is what the bride wants. This is what's elegant. Why can't you just stick to the plan for once? Sienna's eyes flashed, her usual playful demeanor replaced by something fiercer. She stepped closer, her voice low and challenging. And you're so obsessed with control that you can't see past your own rigid ideas. Not everything has to be perfect, Charlie. Sometimes the best moments come from taking risks. Charlie crossed her arms, her jaw tight. Risks lead to mistakes, and I don't do mistakes. Sienna's lips curved into a smirk, but there was no humor in it. Maybe that's your problem. You're so afraid of making a mistake that you never let yourself live. The words hit Charlie like a punch to the gut. She opened her mouth to retort, but the look in Sienna's eyes stopped her. There was something raw there, something vulnerable that Charlie hadn't seen before. It disarmed her, leaving her breathless. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the air between them crackling with tension. The room felt too small, too warm, and Charlie's skin prickled with the weight of Sienna's gaze. She could see the faint flush on Sienna's cheeks, the way her chest rose and fell with each breath. She could smell the faint hint of Sienna's perfume, something warm and floral, like jasmine and vanilla, and it made her head spin. Then, without thinking, Charlie closed the distance between them, her hands gripping Sienna's arms as she kissed her. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was fierce, desperate, and full of all the emotions Charlie had been holding back. Sienna froze for a heartbeat, then kissed her back with equal intensity, her hands tangling in Charlie's hair as she pulled her closer. Charlie's clipboard clattered to the floor, forgotten, as she pressed Sienna against the edge of the table, her body moving on instinct. Charlie's mind was a whirlwind of sensations: the taste of Sienna's lips, the feel of her body pressed against his, the way her heart raced as if it might burst from her chest. She had never let herself go like this before, never allowed herself to be so consumed by someone. But with Sienna, it felt inevitable, like they had been hurtling toward this moment from the very beginning. Sienna's hands slid down to Charlie's waist, pulling her even closer, and Charlie gasped against her lips. The sound seemed to ignite something in Sienna, and she deepened the kiss, her tongue brushing against Charlie's in a way that made her knees weak. Charlie's hands moved to Sienna's hips, her fingers digging into the soft fabric of her dress as she tried to ground herself, to remind herself that this was real. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathless. Sienna's lips were slightly swollen, her cheeks flushed, and her eyes dark with desire. Charlie's hands were still on her hips, her grip loosening as reality began to sink in. "What? What are we doing?" Charlie whispered, her voice trembling. Her heart was still pounding, her body humming with the aftershocks of the kiss. Sienna's gaze softened, and she reached up to brush a strand of hair from Charlie's face. Her touch was gentle, almost reverent, and it made Charlie's chest ache. "I don't know," Sienna admitted, her voice barely audible. "But I don't want to stop." Charlie's breath hitched, her mind racing. This was reckless. This was dangerous. This was everything she had spent her life avoiding. But as she looked into Sienna's eyes, she realized she didn't care. For the first time, she didn't want to overthink. She just wanted to feel. "Tell me this isn't just about rivalry," Sienna whispered, her thumb brushing against Charlie's cheek. "Tell me this is real." Charlie exhaled sharply, her hands sliding up to rest on Sienna's waist. "I don't know what this is," she admitted, her voice raw. "But it's not just rivalry. It hasn't been for a long time." Sienna's lips curved into a small smile, and she leaned in, her forehead resting against Charlie's. "Then let's figure it out," she said softly. "Together." Charlie hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. Then, slowly, she leaned in and kissed Sienna again, this time softer, more deliberate. It was a promise, a surrender, and a beginning all at once. As the world outside faded away, Charlie let herself get lost in the moment. For once, she wasn't thinking about timelines or schedules or perfection. She was just here, with Sienna, and that was enough. The day of the Delacroix wedding dawned bright and clear. the kind of perfect autumn day that made even Charlie's meticulous heart swell with satisfaction. The estate was a vision of elegance and romance, every detail meticulously planned and executed. The ceremony arch was draped in soft white fabric and twinkling fairy lights, the aisle lined with petals in shades of blush and gold. It was a perfect blend of Charlie's precision and Sienna's creativity, a testament to what they could achieve together. As Charlie stood in the ballroom, overseeing the final touches, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. This was her work, her passion, brought to life in a way that felt almost magical. But as her gaze drifted to Sienna, who was adjusting the centerpieces with her usual effortless grace, Charlie realized that the real magic wasn't in the details. It was in the way Sienna had changed her. Sienna looked up and caught her staring, a slow smile spreading across her face. She walked over, her heels clicking softly against the floor, and stopped just inches away. "You know," she said, her voice teasing, "if you keep looking at me like that, people are going to talk." Charlie felt a blush creep up her neck, but she didn't look away. "Let them talk," she said, surprising herself with the boldness in her voice. Sienna's smile softened, and she reached out to straighten Charlie's lapel, her fingers brushing against the fabric. "You did good, Charlie. This is perfect." Charlie shook her head. "We did good. This wouldn't have happened without you." Sienna's eyes sparkled, and for a moment, they just stood there, the world around them fading away. Then Sienna leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You know, there's one thing missing from this wedding." Charlie raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Sienna's lips curved into a mischievous smile. "A dance!" Before Charlie could protest, Sienna grabbed her hand and pulled her onto the dance floor. The room was empty, except for the two of them, the soft strains of a love song playing in the background. Charlie hesitated for a moment, but then Sienna's arms slid around her waist, pulling her close. "This is highly unprofessional," Charlie murmured, though she made no move to pull away. Sienna laughed, the sound warm and melodic. "Relax, Charlie. For once, just let go." And so, Charlie did. She let herself lean into Sienna, her head resting against her shoulder as they swayed to the music. It was quiet, intimate, and utterly perfect. For the first time in what felt like forever, Charlie felt at peace. When the song ended, Sienna pulled back slightly, her gaze searching Charlie's face. "You know," she said softly, "this doesn't have to end when the wedding does." Charlie's breath caught, her heart pounding in her chest. "What are you saying?" Sienna's smile was tender, her eyes filled with a warmth that made Charlie's chest ache. "I'm saying that I want this. United States. I want to figure out what this is, together." Charlie's throat felt tight, her mind racing. This was everything she had been afraid of. Letting someone in, taking a risk, being vulnerable. But as she looked into Sienna's eyes, she realized that she wanted it too. More than anything. "Okay," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Together." Sienna's smile widened, and she leaned in, her lips brushing against Charlie's in a kiss that was soft and sweet and full of promise. When they pulled apart, Charlie felt a sense of calm settle over her, as if everything had finally fallen into place. As the guests began to arrive and the wedding festivities kicked into full swing, Charlie and Sienna stood side by side, their hands brushing occasionally as they worked. And when the final song of the night played, Sienna pulled Charlie onto the dance floor again, not caring about the curious gazes of the guests. "What are you doing?" Charlie murmured, flustered but unable to hide her smile. Sienna grinned, her arms tightening around Charlie's waist. "Celebrating." And when she kissed her, slow and deep under the twinkling lights, Charlie finally let go, because some things, like love, weren't meant to be planned.